I'm likely to get a lot of side eyes and ruffled feathers, as they say, from lots of gardening experts out there, because there's a lot of information that they're spreading that's actually hurting short season gardeners. Short season gardeners that really need to get a big tomato harvest in the shortest period of time. How do I know this? Several years ago, I moved from a warm zone in the United States, zone 9 in Texas, all the way up to Chicago, which is zone 5 or 6, depending on where you are located, closer or farther away from the lake. And I found out that it was hurting my harvests. And when I took a step back, I realized that if I just applied simple, more science-based approaches, I would get huge tomato harvests. Now, you're probably wondering, what are these things? Well, I've boiled them down because it's pretty easy. There's so much of it out there. And frankly, there's tons of content on YouTube that talks about it, to 3 things. And these 3 things, if you essentially stop doing them or look at them from a more scientific approach for your short season, you will get huge tomato harvests. Number 3 is a really good one, so stick around for number 3, as it alone will likely make your tomato harvest absolutely the best that you've ever had. Okay, so for the first one, this is gonna really ruffle a bunch of feathers. That's why I'm making it number 1. You've probably all heard it that are watching this. And that's, they tell you to bury your tomato plants as deep as you can. In fact, most experts will even go as far as recommending cutting several sets of leaves off so that you can bury them super, super deep. And the theory here is, well, kind of like a lot of things in life, there's a little bit of truth in it, but it's unlikely to help you, especially if you're a short season gardener. They tell you that it forces the tomato plant to create roots from its stem, which it will, and it's really cool. Those are called advantageous roots. And the plant has developed this capability in order for it to be able to root as much as it can. If it gets knocked over in the wild and it doesn't have a gardener to take care of it, and its root system gets disturbed, it's able to do that. But let's think about this for a second. You're burying it deep. Now the plant is going to have to take its energy, and it's going to have to deal with this part of its stem that's buried deep in the ground, and it's going to have to go into this mode that's kind of like a stress mode, right? It's like a healing mode, like if we get cut, right? And it's going to start to produce new roots rather than growing out, extending, making stronger the roots that it already has, which are different types of roots. This is where science comes into this. And so what's going to happen is you're actually going to slow the plant down. Now, a lot of varieties, which we'll get into in a moment, or types of varieties, they actually already have quite a long window of when you plant to when you can harvest. In fact, a lot of tomatoes tend to be around 70 to 90 days. Some of them are even 100 or 120. So if you're a short season gardener, you just did something that slowed the plant down. Now, make matters worse by taking sets of leaves off. What are leaves? Well, leaves are like the solar panels, right? And a new seedling needs that in order to capture the energy of the sun, be able to convert the nutrients and the gases in the air in order to grow really big and hopefully make lots and lots of trusses and flower clusters, right? In order to produce enough fruit. So what you're doing is you're cutting those off. The other thing that you're doing is you're introducing open wounds, and then often, if you're following the directions of some of those experts, you're putting those open wounds in the soil. And we all know that a lot of soil-borne illnesses tend to be the nasty ones that get our tomato plants. So there's not a lot of science behind this. Now, I will say that there's a little bit of truth in everything. And what do I mean? If your tomato plants aren't very healthy, and the way that they're not healthy is that they've stretched maybe towards light when you were growing them, or maybe you just bought them from a nursery or a big box store and they were not in very good shape, and you've got these long stretched tomato plants, then yes, probably the best thing you can do to try to salvage those things, because otherwise they're just going to flop over, is either to support them or maybe bury them a little bit and try to get them to produce some roots. Either way though, it's not ideal and it's going to slow it down. So that was number one. I would definitely recommend, and I have evidence of this, and there's science that I can point to as well, just when you go to transplant the tomato plant, just transplant it like you always would. If you've got a strong, sturdy, stocky tomato plant, just transplant it right in the ground, right up to where the top of the soil is in the pot that you're transplanting it from. And what's going to happen is it's going to very quickly go from a state of, some transplant shock, right? It's hard to avoid entirely. And then it's going to start growing those roots out that it already has. They're going to get larger, they're going to get denser, they're going to get healthier. And then that's going to much faster, it's going to produce vegetative growth on top, and it's going to start building out and growing bigger and bigger and bushier and healthier and growing more tomato trusses, so that when it hits that peak window where it starts to produce flowers and eventually tomatoes, you will have a very healthy, large tomato plant. All right, so for number two, advice that a lot of these experts give that really hurt us short season tomato growers is this one: pruning your tomato plants like crazy. This is the one I hear a lot of, and we'll get a little bit into two different types roughly of tomato plants, and where again there is a little bit of truth in this, but generally speaking, a lot like when it comes to chopping a bunch of leaves off in order to bury your tomato plant deeper, whenever you cut your tomato plant, you are inducing a little bit of stress. Now, there is some truth that it might cause the tomato plant to create more of those. But if you're under the assumption, because of the expert advice, that you're trying to reduce some of the vegetative growth in order to maybe produce more flowers, more trusses, which is what a lot of the experts give you advice on, and you're a short season gardener, that plant might not have enough time to, when it triggers it to produce more of those, to make them large enough to produce trusses. So you might just be encouraging a lot of small vegetative growth. So pruning them is not actually going to help out. Now, if you're planting a variety of tomatoes that's not the bush type are called determinates because they have a determined size, time that they're going to flush with lots of flowers and produce lots of tomatoes. There's another type that is really common, and that will lead to number three, so just hang in there. And that's indeterminate. And what a lot of experts say to do, which again isn't necessarily not true, but it's unlikely that it's going to help you out if you're just a backyard urban gardener and you have a short growing season, and that's indeterminate plants. These are these tomato plants that actually naturally will vine along the ground, What a lot of people do, and I do it as well, is you train them up in some way. There's a lot of ways to do it. I use strings and I train them up. And what a lot of folks will do is the experts will tell you to grow them as a single leader and to constantly be pruning off what's called the suckers so they don't create any more of these leaders. And the reason why they tell you this is actually some really good fact-based advice, but it's primarily for people that grow in either they have long seasons or they have something like a hoop house or greenhouse that's really tall that can protect the plant and can either give them a long growing season or a longer growing season. And what they do then is they grow these up really, really tall, and then as they start to fruit and they harvest fruit, they trim those off when they harvest, and then they lean the plants, and then they keep doing this. Why does that work for them so well? Well, it's because they're planting hundreds usually of tomato plants, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to reduce their labor costs. And it costs them a lot of money and time, right? Time is money in order to plant those tomato plants. So this way they don't have to replant them and they can just keep harvesting them. So that works really well, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, I do that in certain ways in my own garden. But in general, determinate tomato plants, especially in a short season, you don't want to prune them at all. You just want to give them a lot of space, treat them really well, nurture them, and they will produce so many tomatoes that whether you wanted to can tomatoes or not, you probably will have to can tomatoes. All right, so we're finally to number 3. And this one, like I said, is a doozy because you might not even realize it. And why is that? Because there's actually 2 types of tomato plants in general, right? There's all the varieties within there. And I talked about it when we talked about number 2. And that's determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. This can be extra tricky because many seed companies either make it difficult to find or they don't provide the information at all. And that's whether or not that particular tomato that you're looking at to potentially buy seeds is a determinate or an indeterminate. So sometimes it's really, really hard to figure out. And that makes it even more of a pain. In addition to that, sometimes the only advice that's given about growing tomatoes and the varieties that they list are indeterminate. That can make it difficult for a short season grower. Why is that, you're wondering? Well, the reason why is indeterminates sound like a really good thing, and they are for particular situations. But for a short season grower, if it takes a little bit longer, which a lot of the indeterminates do, to start flowering, and then when they start to produce tomatoes, they produce a few sets or trusses of tomatoes at a time, and then they keep doing that. But your season is already getting cold, and now that tomato plant can't produce any more flowers, then you're actually going to get a lot less tomatoes from an indeterminate type tomato. That brings us to determinate varieties, which I would highly recommend if you're a short season tomato grower. And that is because determinate varieties typically will begin to flower faster. Some of them do so in like 55 or 60 days. And when they do, they will produce all of their flowers pretty much at once, or, in a window, let's say a couple of weeks or more. And they'll just produce tomato after tomato after tomato. Now, if you want to can tomatoes because you're a short season gardener and you can't grow tomatoes in the winter and you'd love to be able to open up a can of tomatoes and make some amazing pasta sauce, right? Then you need a lot of tomatoes at once, and having a short season can make that difficult. But determinate type varieties open up that possibility. Just give them enough room and give them some support and don't prune them. So if you follow the other sort of anti-advice, I don't know if that makes any sense, but you know, if you don't bury the tomato plant, if you don't prune it heavily, and you choose a determinate variety, you will get tons of tomatoes in the short season that you have. And you likely will have a new, much more advantageous problem, and that's you will not know what to do with all of the amazing tomatoes that you have. So give it a try, and if you have determinate varieties that are really working for you, I would love to hear about it. Let me know what zone you're in, depending, you know, on where you are in the world. Let me know where you're from, and let me know what determinate variety and what you really like about it. I'd love to hear about it. And I'd love to just chat about the determinate varieties that I'm really enjoying. Right now, the determinate varieties that I'm growing are Roma VF, and then I'm also growing a determinate called Ace 55, which I really love. And I can all those, and the Ace 55 I also eat, you know, as like a slicing tomato. So those are really amazing, and it will unlock for a short season gardener the ability to have tons and tons of luscious, juicy tomatoes, which, let's face it, that's why a lot of us garden. Now, all of this revolves around starting with a really healthy seedling. So I'll see you in the next video where I tell you how to have super healthy vegetable seedlings that will help with everything, not just tomatoes. See you there.